In Kelowna, British Columbia, on the floor of a 250,000 square foot factory, workers were doing something no mass-market truck manufacturer would ever attempt. They were modifying each machine by hand to individual customer specifications before it left the building. The truck was called Western Star. The terrain it was built for, the logging roads, the oil field haul routes, the mountain passes that destroyed every standard American rig sent against them, demanded nothing less. At its peak, the Kelowna plant employed hundreds of workers in the Okanagan Valley and supplied Canada's most punishing industries with the only truck engineered specifically to survive them. Then, on October 12, 2001, Freightliner announced the plant would close permanently. 675 jobs. One announcement. This is the story of how a truck born in the BC wilderness became a Canadian institution, and how a German conglomerate, a union that blinked in Oregon, and a dollar that rose too far made keeping it impossible. The story begins not with a truck, but with a problem. Canada's resource industries in the 1960s were operating in conditions that American truck manufacturers had never designed for and showed no particular interest in designing for. Logging operations in British Columbia ran equipment upgrades and around switchbacks that would destroy a standard Class 8 drivetrain in a season. Oil field haul routes in Alberta crossed terrain that existed on no American roadmap. The machines coming out of factories in Ohio and Michigan were built for interstate highways and regional distribution runs. They were not built for this. In 1967, the White Motor Company decided someone should build for this. The division they launched was called White Western Star, and they placed it in Kelowna, British Columbia, a city in the Okanagan Valley surrounded by orchards and mountains, closer to the industries it would serve than any American factory could ever be. The model that defined the brand arrived in 1968. The 4900 was not a truck that came off a line and shipped to a dealer in a standard configuration. It was a platform, massively customizable, driver-focused, assembled by hand on the Kelowna factory floor, where workers modified each machine to the specific requirements of the customer ordering it. Weight ratings, axle configurations, engine specs, cab arrangements. A logging contractor in the Prince George region needed something different from an oil field operator in the Peace River country, and Western Star built accordingly. Through the 1970s, the Kelowna plant expanded to reflect the demand. Manufacturing space reached 250,000 square feet. Warehousing added another 50,000. Hundreds of workers built their lives around the factory in the Okanagan Valley. The industries being served, logging, mining, oil transport, were the industries that built Western Canada, and the trucks serving them carried that weight consciously. Western Star's founding identity was not accidental. It was over-engineered by design, custom by default, and built on a single premise: that the people doing the most brutal work in the country deserved a machine that took that work as seriously as they did. In 1980, White Motor Company collapsed into insolvency. It was the kind of corporate failure that swallows everything attached to it. Volvo moved quickly, acquiring the bulk of White's truck assets and absorbing them into a Scandinavian portfolio that had no particular interest in a niche Canadian operation built for logging roads and oil fields. Western Star was deliberately excluded from that purchase. Instead, two Calgary-based energy companies stepped in. Bow Valley Resources and Nova Corporation each took a 50% stake in what remained, and for the first time since its founding, Western Star was unambiguously a Canadian company, owned by Canadian capital, answerable to no foreign parent. The truck that had been built for Canada now belonged to Canada. What followed through the 1980s was not dramatic expansion or aggressive reinvention. It was something quieter and more durable. Western Star carved out a position in the market that the major American manufacturers could not easily attack, because they had never fully understood what they were attacking. Kenworth and Peterbilt built excellent trucks. They built them for roads, for predictable loads, for conditions that could be specified in an engineering document. Western Star built trucks for conditions that could not be fully specified, because the men ordering them had learned through experience that the spec sheet never told the whole story. Owner-operators across Western Canada understood the difference. Fleet managers in the logging and oil patch sectors understood it. The reputation was not built through advertising campaigns or dealer incentive programs. It was built on machines that came back from places other machines did not come back from. By the end of the decade, Western Star held approximately 6% of Canada's Class 8 market. That number sounds modest. In a market dominated by American volume manufacturers with continental distribution networks and pricing advantages that a Kelowna factory could never match, 6% represented something close to a ceiling and something close to a fortress. The customers who chose Western Star chose it deliberately, specifically, and loyally. The truck had become more than a product. It had become a statement about what kind of work mattered, and about the conviction that the people doing that work in the Canadian bush deserved a machine built by people who knew exactly what that bush could do to a truck that wasn't ready for it. The early 1990s arrived with the particular crisis that had been building quietly for years before it announced itself. Bow Valley Resources had been carrying its truck division through a period of sustained financial pressure, and by 1991 the pressure had become untenable. The parent company was in distress. The options narrowed. A sale was necessary, and the field of serious buyers was not large. Heavy truck manufacturing is a capital-intensive business with thin margins, a specialized customer base, and no obvious appeal to the kind of investor looking for a straightforward return. Western Star required someone who understood it specifically. The buyers who emerged came from Queensland, Australia. Terry Peabody and Bob Shand had been importing and assembling Western Stars in Australia since 1983. They had spent nearly a decade learning the truck from the operator's side, understanding what made it valuable to the kind of customer who worked in conditions that standard equipment could not handle. When the Canadian parent collapsed, they were the ones who knew what they were buying and why it was worth buying. The irony was not subtle. A truck built for Canada, rescued by Australians when Canadians could no longer afford to keep it. Under Peabody and Shand, Western Star did not retreat. It expanded. In 1995, the company acquired Ontario Bus Industries, a manufacturer based in Mississauga, renaming it Orion Bus Industries and adding a passenger vehicle division to what had been a pure freight operation. The following year, 1996, Western Star acquired ERF, a British heavy truck manufacturer with its own loyal customer base and its own engineering traditions. For a period that deserves more recognition than it has received, Western Star was a genuinely international heavy vehicle group. Trucks and buses and British lorries, all administered from a headquarters in Kelowna, British Columbia, a city of orchards and mountains in the interior of Canada that had somehow become the operational center of a multi-continent manufacturing enterprise. It was an unlikely configuration and an unstable one. The capital required to sustain 3 distinct manufacturing operations across 3 countries was considerable, and the synergies between a British Columbia logging truck and Ontario City bus and a British motorway hauler were limited at best. The international moment was real. It simply was not going to last, and the buyer already forming an interest in Stuttgart would make sure of that. In 2000, Daimler Chrysler's Freightliner division acquired Western Star and Orion Bus Industries, combined for approximately 670 million Canadian dollars. It was the largest transaction in the company's history, and the moment that decided everything that followed, though the decision would not become visible for another 12 months. Freightliner's chief operating officer made the promise, publicly and on the record, the Western Star brand would survive. Its unique character would be protected. The truck that had been built for conditions no standard manufacturer would design for would continue to be built for those conditions by the people who had always built it, in the city where it had always been built. The promise was not insincere. It was simply in competition with arithmetic. Western Star's market share in the United States at the time of the acquisition was under 1%. One truck in every 100 on American highways carried the Star badge. For a company the size of Daimler Chrysler, operating at the scale Freightliner operated at, 1% was not a market position. It was a rounding error. The entire logic of the acquisition rested on the assumption that Western Star's engineering reputation and loyal customer base could be leveraged into something larger, into a meaningful share of the American Class 8 market, where the volume lived and where the margins that justified a $670 million purchase price could actually be generated. That logic required growth. Growth required cost efficiency. Cost efficiency required looking at every facility in the network and asking the same question. Freightliner already operated manufacturing plants in the United States. It had the Sterling Truck Plant in St. Thomas, Ontario. It had facilities in Portland, Oregon, and elsewhere across the American manufacturing belt. The Kelowna plant, producing a low-volume specialty truck at Canadian labor costs, occupied a specific and vulnerable position in that network. Not the most vulnerable, perhaps, on the day the deal closed, but vulnerable in a way that one external event could make decisive. The brand survived the acquisition. The Kelowna plant survived the acquisition. The workforce survived the acquisition. For 11 months, the promise held. Then a union in Portland agreed to take $2 less per hour, and the arithmetic that had always been running quietly in the background completed its calculation and delivered its answer. On October 12, 2001, Freightliner announced that the Kelowna plant would close permanently. 675 jobs. One announcement. 11 months after the promise. The stated reasons were familiar to anyone who had watched a manufacturing closure unfold in Canada during that decade. A collapse in the North American heavy truck market following the economic slowdown of 2001. Higher labor costs at the Canadian facility relative to Freightliner's American plants. The language was clinical and the logic was presented as inevitable. The kind of arithmetic that admits no appeal and invites no negotiation. But the arithmetic had been accelerated by something specific. Earlier that year, unionized workers at Freightliner's Portland, Oregon facility had agreed to accept a $2 per hour reduction in wages. $2. The number sounds small against the scale of a $670 million acquisition and a workforce of hundreds. It was not small. It was the number that made Kelowna uncompetitive overnight, that tipped a calculation which might otherwise have landed differently, that converted a vulnerable position in the network into an indefensible one. The choice was not only between Kelowna and Portland. Freightliner also operated the Sterling Truck Plant in St. Thomas, Ontario. 2 Canadian facilities were in the network when the decision was being made. St. Thomas survived. Kelowna did not. The criteria that separated them were not made fully public, but the direction of the decision was clear enough. A low-volume specialty plant in a British Columbia valley, producing trucks at Canadian costs, against a facility that had just demonstrated its willingness to absorb a wage reduction, was not a difficult comparison to resolve. Approximately 600 production workers lost their jobs in Kelowna. Around 100 managers and engineers were offered relocation to Portland, where the brand's production would transfer in late 2002. Most of them took it, because the alternative was the same unemployment the production workers faced, only with more options attached. Portland did not absorb the transplant unaided. The state of Oregon contributed $1.25 million to support the transition. The city added $2.2 million in training assistance. Public money, American public money, smoothing the transfer of a Canadian operation to American soil. Canada contributed nothing comparable. No provincial intervention materialized in British Columbia. No federal program cushioned the impact on Kelowna. The 600 workers who did not relocate were left to find what the Okanagan Valley economy could offer: a machinist or a welder or an assembly worker in a city that had just lost its largest industrial employer. The promise had lasted 11 months. The plant would take longer to empty. The last Western Star built in Kelowna rolled off the factory floor in late 2002. 23,500 square meters of Canadian heavy truck history went quiet. The tooling transferred to Portland. The engineers followed. The brand continued. But the building that had generated the brand, the specific floor where the 4,900 had been hand-assembled for 3 decades, sat empty. It would remain empty until it was eventually sold and converted to other commercial use. A warehouse in the end, the same destination that awaits most things industry leaves behind. The closure did not happen in isolation. Kelowna in 2002 was not the first Canadian city to watch a factory floor go silent and wonder what came next. The Collingwood shipyards had closed in 1986 after a century of continuous operation. Manufacturing towns across Ontario and British Columbia were absorbing the same arithmetic at different speeds. The calculation that Canadian labor costs, plus a rising dollar, plus a continental trade framework that offered no particular protection to domestic producers, equaled closure, eventually, for anything that could be built more cheaply somewhere else. Western Star continued under Daimler. The brand survived in the way that brands survive when the original reason for their existence has been operationally removed. Production ran in Portland through the 2000s. In 2015, Daimler moved some Western Star manufacturing to Cleveland, North Carolina, deeper into the American South where labor costs were lower still. At various points, relocation to Mexico was considered, completing a trajectory that had begun on a factory floor in the Okanagan Valley and was moving steadily toward wherever the next calculation pointed. The numbers that defined the brand's position told the story cleanly: under 1% of the American Class 8 market. The growth that had justified the $670 million acquisition never materialized at the scale required. 6% of the Canadian market, the fortress the brand had built through 3 decades of loyalty and reputation, was now being served by trucks built in Portland and North Carolina and sold back into the country that had originally created them. The profits generated by Canadian customers buying Western Stars flowed to Stuttgart. The jobs that had once accompanied those transactions remained in Oregon and North Carolina. The Kelowna building became a warehouse. British Columbia retained the name of a truck it no longer built and no longer owned, a ghost brand haunting the highway corridors where the real thing had once been assembled by hand, for the specific terrain, by people who understood exactly what the terrain required. Today, Western Star is legally an American manufacturer, headquartered in Portland, Oregon, a subsidiary of Daimler Truck AG. The Kelowna plant is a warehouse. Somewhere on a logging road in northern British Columbia, a Western Star built in Kelowna is probably still running. The machine outlasted the factory. The factory outlasted the country that built it. That is the nature of things made well. They persist after the conditions that made them possible have gone. The truck survives, the workers scattered, the building emptied, and the mountain that gave the brand its name still stands above a valley that once knew how to build something worth keeping.